Happiness Day more, and we are still looking at verbs. For today, we shall look at the position of verbs in sentences. But before we start our class today, let's take a look at our objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the position of main verbs in statements, identify the position of auxiliary verbs in statements, and identify the position of auxiliary and main verbs in two kinds of questions. Now, our lesson. We've looked at verbs and we defined verbs as words that show action or words that refer to an action or a state of being. Now, like other parts of speech, verbs have particular places where they occupy in sentences, particular positions where we can find them in sentences. And now we shall take a look at different sentences and how the verbs are positioned in these sentences. The first sentence we shall look at is positive sentences. In positive sentences, main verbs occur immediately after the subject of the sentence. Positive sentences are also known as affirmative sentences, sentences that state facts or that pass an information positively. Here we have, for example, I read my books daily. We find here that the main verb read occurs after the subject I. So we have I read my books daily. And next we have the governor gives his reports annually. The main verb gives occurs after the subject, the governor. So in positive sentences or affirmative sentences, we find that main verbs appear or occur just after the subject of the sentence. Now, also in positive sentences, there are words that can come between the subject and the main verb, and those words are known as adverbs. Only adverbs can appear between the subject and the main verb. Only adverbs can separate the subject and the main verb in positive sentences. Now let's look at these examples. The teacher carefully marked our scripts. The adverb here is carefully. Now remember that adverbs are words that describe or words that tell you more about verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. They describe verbs, they describe adjectives, and they describe other adverbs. Now, in this sentence, the teacher carefully marked our scripts. We find that the adverb carefully has separated the subject and the main verb. And next we have Ade hurriedly went home. The adverb here is hurriedly, and the main verb is went. So we find the adverb between the subject, Ade, and the verb went. So only adverbs can separate subjects and main verbs in positive sentences. Otherwise, you find main verbs occurring just after the subject in positive sentences. Now let's look at how verbs are placed in negative sentences. In negative sentences, auxiliary verbs occur just after the subject of the sentence. Remember in our lesson on auxiliary verbs, we did say that auxiliary verbs are verbs that help main verbs. They are known as helping verbs or copular verbs. They help main verbs make complete meaning. Now, in negative sentences, we find auxiliary verbs occurring just after the subject of the sentence. The auxiliary verbs are usually placed side by side with the word not to show negativity. So we find that in negative sentences, auxiliary verbs occur just after the subject, and they occur just after the word not to show negativity. Main verbs, however, are placed after not. In a negative sentence where you have a main verb and an auxiliary verb, the auxiliary verb comes after the subject, and then you have the word not, and then you have the main verb. For example, Amenze does not go home late after work hours. You find the auxiliary verb does here, and you find the negative word not, and the main verb go. So in negative sentences, you find that after the subject of the sentence, you have the auxiliary verb, you have the word not, which is showing negativity, and then the main verb after not. The next sentence says, I will not entertain any form of laziness in my office. The subject here is I, and we find the auxiliary verb will, and the negative word not, and then the main verb entertain. So, in negative sentences, we have auxiliary verb, the negative word not, and the main verb. So that's how verbs are placed in negative sentences. Now let's take a look at how verbs occur, or the position of verbs in questions. In English grammar, there are two kinds of questions. We have the WH questions, that is, questions that begin with words that start with WH, like where, like when, like who, like what. Those are all WH words. And we also have yes-no questions. These are questions that require a yes or no answer. Now, in WH questions, auxiliary verbs occur just after the WH word. And if there's an action verb in the question, it is usually placed after the subject of the question. Now, when you have a question beginning with any of these words, any of these WH words we've talked about, you have the auxiliary verb occurring after the WH word, and then you have your subject, which is the person being talked about in the sentence, and after the subject, you have your main verb. So that's how auxiliary verbs and main verbs are placed in questions. Now, note that some questions do not necessarily have to come with main verbs. Most questions just have auxiliary verbs. Now, let's take a look at our examples. The first one here says, where are you going to? We find the WH word where, and the auxiliary verb are, and the subject of the question, you, and the main verb, going. So we find that we have auxiliary verb, the subject, and then the main verb in questions that begin with WH words or the word how. Next we have, when will Chima pay me a friendly visit? We find the WH word when, auxiliary verb will, subject Chima, and main verb pay. Now let's take a look at the last example. Who were they discussing with? We also find the WH word who, the auxiliary verb were, and then the subject they, and the main verb discussing. So basically, in questions beginning with WH words, or in WH questions, we find that auxiliary verbs occur after the WH word, and then we have the subject of the question and the main verb of that question. So that's how auxiliary verbs and main verbs are placed in questions beginning with WH words. Now, the second type of questions, which is the yes-no questions, I did say earlier that these are questions that require an answer of yes or no. Now, in yes-no questions, auxiliary verbs are mostly used at the beginning of the question. And if the question contains a main verb, the main verbs occur after the subject of the sentence. Now, in these kinds of questions, in yes-no questions, we find that auxiliary verbs are used at the very beginning of the question. They are used to ask questions. For example, is Jennifer going home now? And we also find that after the auxiliary verb at the beginning of the question, we have the subject of the question and then the main verb of that question. Now, most yes-no questions do not necessarily have main verbs. Most of them just come with auxiliary verbs. But if there's a main verb in a yes-no question, it will come after the subject of that question. Now, let's look at our next example. Are you baking those biscuits for your birthday? Notice that are is the auxiliary verb, and we have the subject you before the main verb baking. And next we have, was Nena writing when you got into her room? Was is also an auxiliary verb. And then we have the subject Nena and the main verb writing. And lastly we have, were the men working at the site? Where auxiliary verb, the men subject, and working main verb. So in yes-no questions, we find that auxiliary verbs begin the question. They are used at the beginning of the question, and then the subject and the main verb. Now we also have some words that, or some verbs that have two words, two-worded verbs. And when we have two-worded verbs, the first verb is usually an auxiliary verb, while the second verb is the main verb. When we have verbs that are made up of two parts or two words, which are verbs, most times you find that the first one or the first word is an auxiliary verb, and the next word is the main verb. For example, James is going home from school. We were playing at the park yesterday. Now notice here that there are two words which are verbs, and the first word is an auxiliary verb, and the second word going is the main verb. And next we have we are playing. Where is an auxiliary verb, and playing is the main verb. So when you have two worded verbs like that, most times the first one is the auxiliary verb and the next one is the main verb. Now this doesn't change the position of those two worded verbs in sentences. We did say earlier that subjects usually come before the main verb in normal sentences or in statements or in affirmative sentences. So whether they are one-worded verbs or two-worded verbs or three-worded verbs, as the case may be, we also have them occurring after the subject of the sentence. Now for three-worded verbs, the first two verbs are usually auxiliary verbs, while the third verb is the main verb. We also have verbs with three words and not just two words. Now when we have such verbs with three words, we find that the first two verbs are usually auxiliary verbs, while the third verb is the main verb. And these verbs also occur after the subject of the sentence. Remember I said earlier that verbs most times, or main verbs in sentences, occur after the subject of that sentence. And only adverbs can separate the subject and the main verb. Now let's look at an example. Biola and her sister have been chosen for the competition. Barry has been writing his report for the past 3 hours. Now notice that these two verbs here are three-worded verbs. And the first verb, have, is an auxiliary verb. The next one, being, is also an auxiliary verb. And the last verb, chosen, is a main verb. Same thing here. has auxiliary verb, been auxiliary verb, and writing main verb. So when we have three worded verbs like that occurring side by side, if you look closely, you would realize that the first two verbs are auxiliary verbs, while the last verb is a main verb. It's impossible to have three worded verbs as main verbs. That is, the first one is a main verb, the second one is a main verb, the third one is a main verb. In English grammar, it is wrong and it is not possible to see such an expression. When you have three worded verbs, they are mostly a mix-up of auxiliary and main verbs. Now, for more complex sentences, however, we find that auxiliary verbs can appear before and after main verbs. Remember we said earlier that for three-worded or two-worded verbs, we have auxiliary verbs before main verbs. But in more complex sentences, we can have auxiliary verbs appearing before or after the main verb. For example, the boy that was beaten is my brother. Now, looking at this expression here, we find was an auxiliary verb, beaten, a main verb, and is an auxiliary verb. So we realize here that there has been a mix-up. Auxiliary verb, main verb, and auxiliary verb. The next example says, the lady whose bag was stolen has gone to the police. Was here is an auxiliary verb, stolen, main verb, has, auxiliary verb, and gone, main verb. So we see that here too we've mixed them up. Auxiliary verb, main verb, auxiliary verb, and main verb. So we don't always have auxiliary verbs stationed before the main verb. They can also come after the main verb, as the case may be in various sentences. Now, why are verbs so important in our sentences? Why do we talk so much about verbs? First of all, verbs are the most important words in sentences because they are the heart of the sentence. Just like the heart is to a human being, the heart pumps blood and sustains a human being. Without the heart, we would be dead. So in like manner, a verb in a sentence functions as a heart. It makes the sentence what it is. It gives the sentence life. Without a verb in a sentence, we cannot call that expression a sentence. So if it must be called a sentence, there must be a verb. Secondly, a sentence is not complete until it contains a verb. That's basically what I've explained. A sentence is not complete without a verb. It would either be called a phrase or something else, but without a verb, it's not a complete sentence. Without verbs, it would be impossible to know what a sentence is saying. Whatever thought or whatever idea you want to communicate to your listeners or to your writers, it's the verb that carries the message. It's the verb in your sentence that relays your thoughts to your listeners or to your readers. So without a verb, you cannot adequately pass your information or what you intend to say to your listeners. And lastly, verbs help to give meaning to the sentence both in speech and writing. Verbs give meaning to your sentence. Verb gives life to your sentence, both when you speak and when you write. We've come to the end of our lesson on position of verbs in sentences. But before we move to our test section, let's take a look at all we have learned so far. We learned that main verbs and auxiliary verbs occupy specific positions in different sentences and in two kinds of questions. We also learned that in affirmative sentences, main verbs occur after the subject of the sentence. And we also learned that in negative sentences, auxiliary verbs occur after the subject of the sentence, while the main verb occurs after the word not. And we said, in WH questions, auxiliary verbs occur after the WH word while the main verb is placed after the subject of the question. And lastly, we learned that in yes-no questions, auxiliary verbs are used at the very beginning of the question, while the main verb is placed after the subject of the question. Now let's move to our test section. Question 1 says, pick the most appropriate sentence based on the verb position. A, Adana and I, home we went. B, I and Adana went home. The correct answer is B, I and Adana went home. Remember, I did say that verbs naturally occur after the subject of a sentence. But we find in option A that the verb occurs after the object. Adana and I, home, we went. Home is the object of this sentence, and went is the main verb at the end, so this is wrong. I and Adana went home. I and Adana are the subject, went is the verb, and home is the object. So if you picked B, you are correct. Question 2 says, which of these questions are asked properly? A, you are done with your assignment. B, done with are you your assignment? And C, are you done with your assignment? The correct answer is C, are you done with your assignments? Remember when I was talking about questions, I did say that auxiliary verbs can also be used to ask questions at the beginning of the question, and the word are here is an auxiliary verb used to ask that question. We've come to the very end of our lesson today on position of verbs in sentences. I do hope you learned a lot. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.